Okay, so this is approximately a 4 hour, maybe 4.5 hour tattoo. And I we filmed most of it, although some of it didn't turn out as good, but I just chopped up a bunch of it so that I could just talk a little bit, make some comments, and keep it under an hour because I didn't want you guys to have to suffer through too much. So here it is. You can see that I already put the stencil on. And this is a watercolor style mushroom crystals and poppy design. And I left the stencil to dry for about 15 to 20-ish minutes. And I am having her lay flat on the table. And I'm starting with a 3-liner and black ink. And you can see that I have the paper towel kind of scrunched up in my non-tattooing hand, which is where I like to keep it. So I don't always keep it there, but at least while I'm working with the stencil still on the skin, I don't want to wipe any of that wet paper towel over the stencil that I possibly would lose part of it, so I don't want to do that. And the way that she's laying, if I consider the closest to me being the bottom of the tattoo, then I'm kind of trying to work up from the bottom to the top. That is just mainly just to keep your stencil on. Now, sometimes I jump around a little bit, but I'm also very careful about where I'm placing my hands. I'm just conscious of not wiping the stencil away because honestly, that sucks when it happens. And not like you couldn't get a pen and redraw it in, you could, but if it's something that's a really geometric design, really perfect, that would suck to have to do that. And in fact, some that are really detailed and complicated would be super hard. See how I'm very carefully wiping? I put my finger, the tip of my finger, right where the wet spot on the paper towel is, and wipe it very carefully away from the rest of the stencil and just kind of towards myself, and then turn to the dry spot. And I don't like the skin to be really slippery with soap, so I try to keep it pretty dry most of the time. So let me see here. I think I'm just make my thing a little bigger so you can see it. Okay. At this point, what I did was I rinsed my needle out really well, and so essentially I am tattooing the inside spots on the mushroom with just water, which the old school term for that is bloodlining. People call it waterlining now because bloodlining sounds bad. You could also use a super light gray wash, and see how quick I'm going. I'm just busting through that really fast because literally the reason it's called a bloodline is because when you do that with just water, it makes a little reddish line that you can then follow later. And the reason I'm doing these little spots is to keep that spot within the mushroom reserved for white highlights at the end of the tattoo. So I believe that I go in and just go ahead and do all of those with just the water line at this point, I think. You can also see that I'm stretching the skin with a 3-point stretch. In this case, my middle finger and index finger are 1 point together. Sometimes I use one or the other, but sometimes both. And then the thumb would be the other part, and the side palm of my tattooing hand is the other part. And you can just see right there that I just lifted up and then stretched a little tighter because I could feel that I needed to. And that's something that you guys are going to have to get used to as well. You'll have to lift up and re-stretch. See, I just did it again right there. When you're moving your hand around, even if you're still continuing without dipping. And there, just did it again. So that's something that you're going to constantly do, especially on areas that are quite stretchy. This spot's not really terribly stretchy, but like, let's say it was a stomach or a lower like side of the back, where it's pretty stretchy on like the hip area, and on some people pretty stretchy. You're gonna probably have to do that a lot. See, I just dabbed that rather than wiping it because I wanted to make sure that I got the lines without wiping the stencil next to it away. Right there, I'm just doing the stem of the poppy, and it needed to be a little straight line. And at this point, I see how I am holding with just my index finger and my thumb right there, and side palm. Just getting with the 3-liner, getting the, essentially I'm just kind of working on getting the whole tattoo stencil in with the 3-liner, and then I'll come back later and build up the lines with a 7-liner or a 9-liner. I can't remember which one I had out, either one. But just kind of getting through all the line work first. And a lot of times when I'm doing something with kind of different layers and different dimension, I use a darker line for the outside, a black line essentially, and then for the inside I'll use a gray wash, which just gives it a little bit more dimension. So there's a little bit of difference between the outside line and the inside lines. Also, sometimes I'll use colored lines, but I'm careful with colored lines because you don't want something that's going to stay super crisp to have a colored line. Say, for instance, text. If you want it to stay super crisp, that's just not going to happen, because over time, different color pigments will actually spread a little bit more than black, which is why you mostly see so many things outlined in black. If you're doing something that's not a lot of line work, more painterly or portrait style, or something that's, yeah, just doesn't have hard outlines, it's still crucial to add shadows and dark in that so that things will pop and there'll be contrast and that kind of thing. But going back to this design, you can see just from looking at the design that I made, the mushroom that's in front is not only larger, so the proportions actually help it look like it's in front, but also when I get to the building up of lines, I'm going to make the line around the mushroom the heaviest line in the whole design, which will help bring it forward a little bit too. And then the crystals are going to get a color line. They're going to get a blue line, and the mushroom that's in front and the one that's kind of in the back there will have a little hair darker reddish, and then the front mushroom will be a brighter red also, so that helps it stand out too. So we jumped to a little bit forward to where I already did some of the blue lines on the crystals, and you can see I waited a little while before wiping just because I was a little nervous about some of those tiny lines disappearing, and that's what happens, is it's a little harder to wipe if you wait as long as that, but it does help when you're trying to get something in that you just want to get it in without losing the lines. And also on that note, see how smeary the blue is. Blue ink and even purple, but mostly blue, usually go through a lot of paper towels because it just is so thick and opaque, and it just has a little bit harder time wiping and smears quite a bit. So there you see I put a dry paper towel under my non-tattooing hand, and that's to protect the rest of the stencil, which is something you guys could do too, for sure. So, because honestly, even though it seems like I might have mentioned it a few times, but that is something you worry a lot about when you're first starting out, is losing your stencil. It's not as important when you have more of a organic, natural shapes and that kind of thing design. But for sure, when you're really heavily reliant on line work, you want to keep that on as long as possible, which also helps to leave the stencil drying for at least 20 minutes or even longer. Honestly, the longer you leave it on, the more it's going to stay on. Individual people's skin is a little bit different. Like some people, they tend to come off easier, and some people it sticks really hard. But in general, if you leave it on longer, it'll stay longer. And you can see that I'm just continuing with the blue lines, getting all those lines in with the 3-liner, and then I'll come back later and outline the individual crystals with a little bit heavier blue line, which is another way to kind of create some separation among the little crystals, and then also the lighter, or thinner, I should say, lines inside just creates a little bit of dimension. It gives the illusion, I guess, that it's going to get some shading and stuff too, and some white highlights, so that'll give the illusion with the blue that it's crystal, that it's made out of crystal. Outlining things that are, or even if you line something in, oops, there goes my phone. If you line something in black and then you come back right next to the black and outline it with some blue, that can also kind of give the hint of something. Say it was a butterfly wing and you wanted it to seem more transparent, then doing blues in that is helpful too, because honestly, as you probably figured out by now, white is a very tricky color to get. So if you were going to do a snowman or something, say, obviously you're not just going to pack in a bunch of white because it's going to be very blotchy and splotchy the way it heals. You'll have to use like blues and maybe even gray washes to create the illusion of white, or maybe if you're trying to do something metallic or something like that, or crystal or butterfly's wing or something where you're trying to create the idea of transparency, blues and some white can help with that. So let's see here. My designs are I think getting more and more what I would call sort of abstract, graphic, watercolor splashy. I need to come up with a better terminology for my own style. Not quite sure what that is yet. Anyway, so still using a 3. The power supply is probably set at 7.5, although I can't honestly remember exactly where I set it. Usually with the 3s, I turn them down just because with the 3-liner, and even somewhat with the 5, but even more so with the 3, you can tend to get blowouts a lot easier. So let's see, I'm working on the poppy outline. And on flowers is another place that you can also do like a thinner line on the inside lines, if there's lines inside the flowers, and then a little hair thicker line on the outside to help give it a little bit more dimension as well. In this case, one of the things I definitely like to do is vary my line weight throughout the design, which I think I've probably talked about with everybody. Just gives it a lot more of a 3D effect. There's a lot of different things you can do to accomplish that. But that's probably one of the easiest, is to vary your line weights and put your heaviest lines on the things either that you want to come forward the most or you want to stand out the most. We talked about this in the inking page exercise too. And it looks right there like I'm maybe starting to do a few dots underneath the mushroom caps. Wait, actually, I don't know. I can't see really well. I hope you guys can see it better than I can. I'm in iMovie, and for some reason it won't let me make the screen larger. I think that was still the poppy, yeah. So you probably saw me move my hand a little bit faster when I was doing those lines, and that's when you move your hand a little faster, obviously you're going to get a little bit lighter of a gray line instead of a solid black line, which is fine if you're going to go in and shade around things. Then you don't really need to worry about it. Here I went back to the water lines, inside the mushroom. And also, again, going pretty fast because they don't need to be perfect or anything. These little shapes are not even circles. They're almost like a little blobby shape because the little white speckly things that are on top of the mushrooms are not circular. They're almost like little weird hairy bumps. So, okay. Just going back to that. What else can I talk about? I have my machine grip wrapped only in the just like maybe 2 layers of the bandage, the self-adherent bandage, which I think the brand is called Dynarex. Yeah, Cincy wrap. But anyways, whatever brand it is, I just wrap like twice around my grip, but other people like to put a paper towel under it first and then wrap it over the paper towel to make it thicker, because some people like to have a thicker grip to hold on to. See, I'm just, one of the things that's super important when you first start out is to remember with both of your hands, not the needle itself, but with your hands, you're pushing into the client's skin, which helps a couple of things. It helps you stretch and it helps you hold them really still. And it just also makes for a firmer grip when you're holding onto your needle because you want, your machine, because you want that to be super solid. And there I'm doing sort of the abstract lines around the outside. These I guess kind of remind me of it being reminiscent of a sketch, sort of an abstract element. Using a 3-liner, I wanted these to be thin, and I ain't gonna lie, sometimes those long, straight, thin lines are kind of challenging, and I'll go through the first time and then maybe it's not exactly the way I want it, so I'll go back and touch it up later, and it's actually a little bit tricky to get right back on the same line you already did. Yeah, it actually helps if your needle is out far enough where you can really see the tip of the needle so that you can set it right back on the same line. And that's only if I'm just trying to fix it or straighten it up. Most of the time when you're coming back in trying to fix up a line, what happens, this is the way I describe it. It's like you've created a little rut in the skin. Of course, microscopic, it's very, very, very tiny. But you've created a little rut and the needle kind of wants to just go right back in that same rut when you set it down. So it's actually quite tricky to get right next to the line, or right on the line, but right next to the line to like make it more perfect. It's a challenge. That's probably partially why I steer away myself from doing a lot of very geometric, really straight lines. Just because it's not my favorite. Obviously, you can probably tell from my washy, splashy, fun style that I would like to be less stressed while I'm tattooing. And the more straight lines are in the design, the more stressful it is. I just prefer to have a lot of shapes and bumps and fun and natural lines and that kind of thing. Just because it's easier to have fun and stay relaxed while you're tattooing. It's probably one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of doing text, especially small text. You can see the client every once in a while when I would lift up or rinse my needles, she'd just kind of jiggle her leg because she was laying there a long time. She did a really great job. She literally she didn't say ouch or nothing. She just laid there for like 4.5 hours. Towards the end, she got a little jiggly, but by that point, it doesn't matter as much. Honestly, it's the line work that is the most difficult. And usually with my clients, I'll tell them that I don't talk a lot while I'm doing the lining, because I just need to focus. And they're very understanding of that. I'll talk more when I'm doing the shading and coloring, because it's not so crucial and difficult. It doesn't require quite as much focus. One of the things that I was, oh, actually right there you can see that I just wiped into the area where I already tattooed, so not a big deal. I'm always trying to avoid wiping into the area where the stencil is still intact, so I don't want to mess it up. One of the things to be aware of too, and I may have already talked about this, but in general, you're going to tattoo, if you're right-handed when you're tattooing, you're going to tattoo towards the left or towards yourself. It's just a little bit more stable, a little bit more solid and easier. Obviously there are going to be situations where you can't always do that when you're going around something or whatever, and so you do push away from yourself, but you'll notice there's a little bit of a difference. When you push away, the ink embeds a little bit heavier than when you pull towards yourself. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a little easier to get a consistent line if you stay pulling towards yourself or pulling to the left if you're right-handed, than to go back and forth between the two, because if you do push away, you're going to have to be very aware that the quality of the line will likely change a little bit. The other thing is, in general, see how my fingers are stretched. The non-tattooing hand, the fingers are stretched. And in general, when you're doing a longer line or a continuous line, you do want to stretch in the direction that you're lining. Obviously right there where I'm just doing the tiny little lines inside the poppy, that's not as big of a deal. But if I'm doing a long straight line, like say the top of the mushroom, I would want to make sure that I'm stretching in the direction that I'm lining. Because if you stretch in a different direction and you try lining, the skin kind of like, wrinkles up, it snaps up. It's not as taut, T-A-U-T, taut. Back to the little water-lined circles or blobs inside the mushroom, the little shapes. Just getting those in quickly. I think one of the things that happens to me a lot, because of the designs that I do, it's not necessarily super straightforward with a lot of black heavy line or black fill. I end up having to change my needle sizes, as well as rinsing and switching from black to gray to maybe color or whatever, a lot more maybe than other people would, just because I use all of those, I don't know, special effects or something, special techniques or whatever to create what I'm trying to go for in my tattoos. Definitely won't always be that way, especially if you're just doing black and gray. That'll be so easy because you're just kind of bouncing between a few caps of ink. Or even if your whole outline is all black, all the same, pretty much the same size line, you won't have to rinse so much. And maybe you won't have to be quite as careful either. For the stencil, I mean. Weirdly, sometimes when I'm tattooing a design that's intended to be looked at straight up and down like this one is, and I'm doing it from the side, it's trippy for my brain. I don't know why I have to keep like turning and looking at it straight up and down just to make sure it's all working out the way I want it to. And right here I am doing what am I doing there? Some little dots, because underneath the mushroom cap I'm gonna have like dot work. You saw me right there just lift up my hand and stretch it out, because wow, after a while, a couple of hours, your hand from the stretching gets pretty tired. So obviously you can see that I'm doing individual dots. I'm doing kind of a combination of both. The individual dots and then also the stippling. Right here I'm just kind of going in really quickly and just getting the stencil lines in with dots really fast there. That way I'm not worried about them disappearing. Finding a clean spot-ish. At that point, I think most of the stencil is on, except for that last little bit of swirly lines at the top. You can kind of see in the picture how the little dots are just very reddish. After like 15 minutes or so, they'll stay red for a couple of hours, so you don't have to worry. And in fact, even bloodlines, you can sometimes go away and come back in a couple of weeks if you do even like slightly tinted water. I would say if you use tinted water, it's light. It would be a light enough gray that it would completely disappear once it heals, but it would be there in like in 2 weeks if you wanted to come back and finish something. So like, let's say for example, if I started a large piece and the client was getting way too wiggly, or they just couldn't stand it after 3-4 hours or something, they're like, I just can't finish it, but you still have a quarter of your stencil just sitting there and you don't want to have to try to come back later and exactly lay a piece of the stencil back on an existing partial tattoo, then it would be a good idea to just quickly, with a slightly tinted water or even just the lightest gray, go in really fast and just finish up the lines, just like the most important lines, just so that they're there in a couple of weeks when the person comes back and you don't have to try to figure out a new stencil on that. A lot of times when I'm doing a larger piece, I just pretty much plan 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours, whatever, to do just the outline, and then plan for, different session for shading and color. And also, most of the time, if I'm doing a tattoo that's 4, 5, 6 hours or more, I know that usually means there's a lot of shading and color. And so I pretty much tell my clients all the time that I would like a follow-up session to fine-tune anything that doesn't look great. And the reason for that is, you just never know with someone's skin. You just never know how it's going to heal. You just never know quite how the colors are going to look together. Some people's skin doesn't hold certain colors as well. So it's just really nice if you're doing a large piece that you really care about for your portfolio, we'll say, to pretty much insist on having a follow-up session, even if it's just an hour or two. So now you can see that I'm completely done with the outline, so I'm wiping it really good. At this point, it doesn't matter where I wipe because it's all on, yay! But you can see that there's the blue on the crystals, there's the light blood lines in the little dots in the mushrooms, and then everything else is black, but it's all pretty much the same line weight at this point. Oh, she was getting a little tired right there. Okay, let's see. Okay, I put I put some little green lines down at the bottom for the grass. So there's not going to be any black lines in that. I'm trying to figure out what was I doing there. Don't remember. Oh, I'm doing the dot work, the stippling on the mushroom. There we go. Getting in the cracks where there would be more like natural shading. So there's a word that I heard from Jake Meeks. I used to always say illustrative realism, which is a thing. I have a book about it. It's really cool, which is basically like dragons and things that aren't really real. They're not really real in real life, but you can make them look really real. But he used a term called illustrative believability. So in other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be realistic, but at least believable. So even if it's stylistic or cartoony or something, it's still believable to people. So you can use tricks to fool the eye and different techniques and that kind of thing. Anyways, so I pay attention in this one a little bit to the fact that, yeah, the mushrooms are semi-realistic looking, and the shading would be somewhat under the cap, like right under the cap, and then there would be some shading created from that little bottom part where the crystals are overlapping and slightly underneath the poppy. These are just little subtle things that you'll discover as you go along. And having the whole stencil done, having all the lines done, is so much more freeing. You can just kind of jump around the whole thing and play. More relaxing for sure. I think with clients that the thing they probably hate the most is the constant wiping. I've had so many people tell me that. And yet, it kind of has to be that way because you gotta see what you're doing. You can help avoid extra discomfort by, keeping the paper towel moist and trying not to dry wipe them too much, especially like dry wiping all over the whole thing. Starting to come together. Just shading a little bit underneath the middle part of the stem of the mushroom. So with the stippling, you can see that I'm using several different things. If I'm on the edge that needs to be the darkest, I'm whipping away from the edge. But then in other areas, I'm going back and forth. I definitely have to stop a lot and kind of step back or stand up and look at something from a bit of a distance, because always when I'm tattooing, I'm wearing glasses that are magnifying glasses. And sometimes, and even when I didn't used to wear glasses, you're so close to the design, you're just staring right at it and you're really focused, and sometimes you're just really focused on one small area. And then you like step back and you look at the whole thing, and sometimes you're just like, oh my god, this one line looks so terrible, and then you step back and look at it and it's like, oh, that actually looks good. Especially when you let go of the stretch. Sometimes when you're stretching the skin, especially in a very stretchy area like say the lower back, you'll think, oh, I just didn't get that ink in or whatever. Then the client will stand up, step a few feet away, and you look at it and it looks really good. So it's always good to take a second look, step back, have the client stand up sometimes, especially if you're doing a bigger, more complicated piece, and just take a look at it from a few feet away. It's really good to do that at the end of the tattoo too, like, kind of shake it off, and then they get up and walk around for a minute, get a drink of water, whatever, and then look at it again just to see if there's any last little things you want to do before you wrap it up for the day. I am going in here and thickening up the blue lines on the outside of the individual pieces of the crystal. Crystals are interesting and fun to tattoo. You can do them in so many different ways. Kind of popular in the last 5 years. I don't know why. Crystals and mushrooms, kind of a popular thing. One thing that's nice about this part of the design is that there's grass at the bottom that's kind of hiding the bottom part, so you don't have to be quite as careful there. And then also I know that I'm going to go in and put some more greens at the bottom. And there'll be darker greens and some dark, some light greens, and then, oh, well, there we go. So jumping right to, yeah, somehow I missed a piece of chunk of the middle of all of this. But anyway, there it is with a lot more color in it. Already got the little green drippies at the bottom, which is something she specifically requested. And then also, eventually, she's probably going to want to put more things around it. So it's nice to leave around the tattoo sort of not boxed in, shall we say, so that you have room to put other designs, other things around it, and easily blend them or attach them to something else without making it look like too different of a tattoo. That's what I like about the watercolory style. It's pretty easy to add other things to it. Anyway, so you can see that I've got some, let's talk about the poppies for a sec. I put in a dark, I mixed a orange and blue a little bit together with a few drops of brown in it inside of the poppies to give them some dimension with the complementary colors mixed together for shading. And just started kind of putting those in and shaping up the shadows in the poppies. Obviously on the tiny ones you don't have as much room to do a lot as you do on the bigger ones. Usually you go in order of darkest to lightest with your inks. It's a general rule, but it obviously can be broken if you're super careful when you're tattooing an area that is already like next to an area that's got a lot of light in it. You just want to be careful that you don't wipe that directly into open skin, which is what would tint the lighter colors. So right here I'm just shaping the little drippies at the bottom. You can't really see close up. Hopefully I can do another video next week of a little bit more close up on some of the watercolor splashes and stuff. This one's literally just kind of some drips. One of the things about the drips is I try not to make them all end at the same exact place because then that looks a little weird. And I try to keep it an odd number too so it doesn't look super even, because that also doesn't read super well. Putting some different greens in there. Just trying to shape them up so they'll look like watercolor splashies. On the sides you can see I have some just kind of abstract watercolor splashes too. I've been trying to experiment more with abstract things. Weirdly on this you can't really see how bright everything is. I don't know. I mean, it actually looks really bright. Even the photo I took at the end didn't look that bright. She does have darker skin, a little bit darker skin, mediumish tone, so the colors aren't as bright as they would be on somebody with lighter skin. But they were pretty bright, so I don't really know why it's not translating into this particular film. But that's just probably my camera phone, I guess. You can see that I got in the way a lot too. I've been experimenting with videoing in different ways and tripods and that kind of thing, and this one is like an overhead bar thing that goes right above. And I kept thinking, oh no, I'm in the way. So this is where I'm just kind of jumping around from place to place, and the little things that I notice that need to be done still with some of the darker colors before I go on to the lightest lights, which would in this case be mostly yellow and white. Just doing a little bit of shading and I'm using a 7 round shader to get into the little tiny spots inside the centers of the poppies. Just a little bit like probably a medium gray wash. Sometimes, see, I go back and forth between having my finger at this point, because now we're doing shading and coloring, my fingers between stretched and kind of curled like that, and that's mostly just because after a while my hand gets tired of stretching, so then I have to kind of try different things. At this point, it's not as super crucial as it is when you're lining to really get a super great stretch. Working on a leg is always fairly easy just because it's laid out straight in front of you and you don't have to worry about, well, at least in this case, turning the body part around and around like if you were doing something completely around a whole leg or a whole arm. So legs are nice. Some people really hate the upper thigh as far as pain goes. Some people like this wonderful young lady named Brianna. Look, she even has mushroom socks. Isn't that cute? She sat really well, like I said, so well. Just up until the very end, she got a little wiggly, but after 4.5 hours, who can blame her? But some people actually really hate the upper thigh, and they will be a lot more wiggly or say ouch a lot. Some people ask for breaks a lot too, and it's so nice when they don't really need to take too many breaks because you can just get in the zone and stay in the zone. Of course, in a 4-hour tattoo, you probably give them at least 2 breaks, which I think is pretty much all she took. So here I'm now going to the reds, and I have out a kind of a brick red, like a darkish red, and then a medium red and a bright red, so that I can, and starting, so my light source is coming from the right hand upper side. So starting at the left side, I'm doing the darkest colors, and I'm using a round shader to go around those little openings in the skin where the white is going to go later. And that was tricky. It's always tricky when you have a bunch of little things you have to work around. Unfortunately, this being kind of a natural design, organic looking, it's okay if it doesn't turn out perfectly smooth gradation from dark to light. Other times when you do want it to be a perfectly smooth gradation, say if you were doing a cosmic tattoo or something like that, it's a lot trickier. But anyway, 7 round shader to just kind of get around all those spots, and sort of at the bottom. You can see on the larger mushroom I already did a line, and I'm leaving a little space for white at the bottom of the cap, right below that red line, in between the red line and the black line. And it's on the actual real mushrooms, the Amanita muscaria, I think, if I'm saying that right. Amanita. There is a little white on some of them, not all of them, but on the bigger ones there's a little white space at the edge of the cap like that, and it's kind of, it's a little bit of a brokenish line, so it's not like a perfectly straight line. So it was easy for me to use the round shader to just kind of draw that bottom little brokeny line, and then I'll go back in and get around all of those little open spots with the round shader first, remembering to go from left of the side of the mushroom to the right side of the mushroom and the upper mushroom, to go from the dark red to the what did I say, the brick red to like the medium red, then to the brighter red. Even with the round shader, when you're going around all the little openings. Now I'm putting in some orange in the poppies. So the poppies now have sort of that brownish shading and the orange, and then they'll just get a little bit of yellow on them too. I think I might have even put a tiny bit of white on some parts too. And you can see in the smaller areas of tattooing, I pretty much just use a tiny little circle or side to side scrubby motion when I'm doing the solid color. The slower your hand speed when you're doing solid color, the slower your hand speed, the more solid the color will be. And if you speed up your hand, that's where it gets a little more washy or shady. Whether you're using a round shader or a mag. Most of the time, if it's something small like this, I'll use a round shader. But if it's a little bit bigger, I'll use a mag and a round shader. I'll use the mag, like see right here, I'm using the mag for that red in the areas that are a little more open. And then I'll come back in with the round shader for a little tighter spots that I have to jump into. Coming together. I was surprised she was able to keep her leg up. Her left leg up like that, bent for so long. Now you can see her mushroom socks. Yeah, so this gets a little tricky because you're not only blending from dark red to the light bright red, but you're also having to go around all the little openings, leaving skin space, which is interesting. It's one of the things that's a trademark of tattooing and a trademark of watercolor painting too, is leaving, in watercolor painting, you're leaving the white paper for your white spaces. And in tattooing, you're leaving the skin untattooed, because that's going to be the lightest value in your tattoo. Whatever the person's skin tone is, that's your lightest value. And of course there is white, yes, but it doesn't always, as you know, it's tricky. It's kind of ends up blotchy. It's a little harder. It's great for highlights for little tiny areas. But over time, generally white will heal more like a yellowy color in the skin. If you have a lot of color around it, though, it still appears white, which is kind of also the trick with using skin tone as your lightest value. If you put a lot of color around it, then the skin tone appears light or white, which you've probably seen in a lot of tattoos. I mean, even on these little mushrooms, you can see that I didn't even necessarily have to put white in them, because it looks white when you get the red around it. I'm just trying to blend the colors together. In this case, the front mushroom is closest to you, so I still did it fairly bright, because I want the illusion that that little mushroom is closest to you. So it doesn't have a heavy line, but it does still have a bright color. So the goal when I'm trying to do a design like this is to think about what the focal point is and think about how the viewer's eye will move through the design. And obviously the bright red is definitely something that catches someone's eye like almost immediately. And then whites, the lightest colors too, and then the heaviest dark lines. So the intention on this one was to have the eye go straight to the largest mushroom and then just kind of move around to the other mushrooms and then the poppies. Hopefully I accomplished it. I also left a little bit of skin space between that mushroom right there that I'm working on and the biggest mushroom, So I could put a little bit of white around it too to help separate them slightly from each other. My power supply is back to 8.5 at this point when I'm doing the solid color. When it comes to mag needles, they're out just like, gosh, 1/18 of an inch or less, maybe even just a wee bit less than that, like 2 millimeters. It depends. Sometimes if I'm trying to get around things like I am right there with the open skin space, I will pull them out just a little bit further so that I can see the tips easier and get them up against the opening. This is a 9 mag. It's probably my favorite mag to use. I use the 9s and 13s the most. Usually when well, it depends on what I'm doing, but a lot of the time I use a 7 liner, 7 mag, and a 7 round shader. Or sorry, I encourage students to start with those 777. Lucky 777. Depends on what you're doing, but that's pretty good for in general. In the background, the part that I didn't really film, or at least capture in this, I was using the 13 mag. Pretty sure it's I think I had a 9 and a 13 out. So anyways, I was using the 13 mag in the background to get that blue, that lighter blue. Just kind of go around everything and sort of tie it together and give it a bit of a background. Still blending some reds here. Mostly using circle motion and kind of my scrubby motion back and forth with the mag. Another thing about this design is I did leave the stems and mostly the cap. I left parts uncolored. So the stem pretty much just has the stippling dot work, and then what you see there is this person's skin tone, which worked really well in this case because the mushrooms are usually sort of like an off-white creamy color, the stem of the mushroom, and even underneath a little bit. But I did actually end up adding underneath the cap of the mushroom some just different colors, some blues and stuff in there too. Towards the end you'll see that. That was more like an artistic choice. And some pink too, a tiny bit. Getting tricky with the pinky right there. That's just because my hands were getting tired. You know, it's funny, just being an artist for so many years, you know, you're always the most critical of your own work, you know, and other people can say, oh my God, that's so beautiful, I love it so much. And you're still like, oh, thank you. But in your own mind, usually you're saying, oh, I should have done that one line different, or oh, I should have done this, or oh, the color's blah, you know. It's hard to get out of that habit. I'm working on it. Accepting compliments graciously is a good thing to learn how to do. Getting to that bright red now, kind of more over on the right side of the mushroom. I'm trying to leave some space at the top too for a little bit of lighter. I think I put white or maybe a little bit of the yellow, like a brighter yellow, just right at the top. come back with the round shader, getting a little closer to the little circles inside the mushroom. Towards the end of this tattoo, Gil came in and asked me, how much longer do you think you're going to be? And I was like, I don't know, maybe like 30 minutes or longer, but don't make me have to say. And I remember the client, when it was about 30 minutes, and I was like, oh, I still have like 15 or 20 minutes. She goes, that's okay, it's fine. But she was definitely getting a little antsy by that point. That's a lot of colors, a lot of tattooing. And also, I think one of the things that clients complain about the most is, dang, it feels like you went over that spot 15 times. That's because you go away, come back with a different color, come back with another shade, come back with something else. And yep. It does hurt to get tattooed. But some people like me really like it. So there, see, I'm putting a little bit of like orangey yellow at the top too, kind of right around that top part. Also, what happens sometimes towards the end when you've been tattooing for a while and you know your client's getting really antsy, you start to feel kind of antsy. You start to feel like, I gotta hurry. And you kind of have to fight that feeling. If it's something that was intended to be completed in one session, it's hard not to have that feeling, because you just want to be like, I just gotta get this done. Because you're not ever really sure if they're gonna come back. Because they only committed to, one session or whatever, one or maybe half another one. But if it's a session, if it's like, the person's coming back and it's a larger design, like a back or a sleeve or something, then you don't have that feeling quite so much, because they're coming back and it's not as big of a deal. But also, I don't know what it is, but when people are feeling in pain, it's pretty easy to sympathize with their pain when they're starting to get antsy or jiggly. You want to be like, I just don't want to keep going over the same spot over and over. And yet you have to. Okay. Well, there's the end. What did I do here? I thought this was a photo that you could see the whole thing, so hopefully you can. I'm not sure why it's going so slow. But oh well, there you can see it at least. There's my little thin scribbly lines, some little painterly lines. It looks like I didn't quite wipe the top very well, but it's a little harder to see when you're first done with the tattoo, because the blood is still coming to the surface and everything's kind of raw and wiped. But, and also, like I said, I don't know why this doesn't look as bright as it did in person. That's a frustration, because all of the poppy and stuff was very bright looking, oranges and yellows and things in there. As you can see on the poppy that I left it with a thin line, again, so that the main mushroom in the front stands out the most. So there's like a hierarchy of shapes and line weights. You can see the little separation I left there between the front, that biggest mushroom and the back mushroom, so I could put a little bit of white right there to kind of help separate it, and I think that looks really cool. I like it. And then in the underside of the cap, you can see there's a little, I know you can't see it that great, but there is a little bit of blue and a little bit of green and some pink in there too, which is hard to see. And then here's the photo that I took in the back. Also not super happy with the quality of the photo, but there you go. Now you can see the whole thing. Nice. All right, thanks you guys.